It's a mystery that's haunted the quiet hills of West Virginia for over 70 years. 5 children, lost without a trace in what was supposed to be a tragic but clear house fire. But when the flames finally died down, there were no remains, no bones, no bodies, nothing to explain what happened to them. The only thing left were questions. What happened to the Sodder children? Did they die in the fire? Or is there something far darker and more sinister at play? Imagine being the parents of 5 children, only to watch your home burn to the ground. But instead of grieving the loss of your children, you're left wondering if they were ever there at all. And that's exactly what happened to the Sodder family. It all began on Christmas Eve, 1945. The Sodder family, living in the small town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, was preparing to celebrate the holiday. The children, ranging in age from 5 to 14, were excited for the night ahead, decorating the house and getting ready to open presents. But that night, things would take a horrific turn. Around 1 a.m., the family was awakened by the sound of the fire. The house, an old 2-story building, was already engulfed in flames. George and Jenny Sodder rushed to the children's rooms to get them out. In the chaos, they were able to save their youngest, Sylvia, who was just 2 years old at the time. But when George went back in to save his older kids, the staircase had collapsed, trapping the rest of them on the 2nd floor. As the fire raged, George and Jenny could only watch helplessly from outside. By the time firefighters arrived, the house had been reduced to nothing but ashes. Yet, something was off. When the firefighters sifted through the rubble, they found no remains of the 5 children. Not a single bone, not even the faintest trace of their bodies. The fire had been intense, yes, but the heat wasn't enough to completely reduce human remains to ash. And that's when the first sign of something strange emerged. The fire had been so severe that it destroyed nearly everything, yet it had left some objects intact, including the clock, a metal box, and even some of the furniture. Why were these things unharmed, but the children were gone? The family demanded answers, and when investigators arrived, they learned there were more oddities. No one could explain why the children had disappeared without a trace, and some began to speculate that the fire wasn't the cause of their deaths at all. One of the most unsettling discoveries came when George remembered seeing a truck near their property earlier that day. The truck, with a suspicious driver, had been parked on the road for hours, watching the house. George later discovered that the man driving the truck had been acting strangely. His behavior seemed suspicious, even threatening. Could the truck driver have had something to do with the fire? Or was it possible that the children were taken before the fire even started? As the investigation continued, George and Jenny refused to believe that their children were dead. They didn't accept the fire as the cause of their children's disappearance. It was then that they began to explore the possibility of foul play. One theory that emerged was that the children had been abducted and the fire was set to cover up the crime. In the months following the incident, George and Jenny received strange tips and letters that hinted at the possibility of their children being alive. One of the most chilling pieces of evidence came years later, when a woman in Florida contacted the Sodders, claiming she had seen the 5 children in a nearby town, living under different names. The woman said that they were being held captive and that the children were seen in the company of 2 men who had been involved in shady dealings. This led George and Jenny to believe that the children may have been kidnapped as part of a conspiracy to prevent the family from interfering with something criminal. Could the truck driver have been involved? Could the fire have been part of a plot to erase all evidence of the abduction? Even more baffling were the reports of a strange sighting. A few weeks after the fire, a local woman claimed to have seen the children standing at a gas station, waiting for a car to pick them up. But when she tried to speak to them, they quickly got into the car and drove off, leaving her with more questions than answers. To this day, the mystery of the Sodder children remains unsolved. Despite years of searching, the family never found definitive proof of their children's fate. Some say the children died in the fire, while others believe they were abducted long before the flames ever started. The Sauter family's quest for answers has never ceased, with George and Jenny even putting up a billboard, offering a reward for information that could lead to the truth. But as the years go on, the question remains. What really happened to the 5 Sauter children? Were they taken and hidden away? Or did they perish in the fire, their bodies hidden by forces unknown? The mystery of the Sauter children is one that has captivated people for decades. It's a story of loss, hope, and the unsettling feeling that sometimes the truth is just too dark to uncover. If you have any theories or thoughts on what might have happened, feel free to share them in the comments. And don't forget to check out our next video, where we delve into another chilling real-life mystery. It's the kind of mystery that chills you to the bone. A young, promising medical student full of life steps into a bar and is never seen again. No explanation, no clues, just a strange, empty hole in the timeline. Brian Schaffer, 27 years old, vanished in 2006 without a trace. Surveillance footage shows him entering a bar that night, but the most disturbing part? There's no footage of him leaving. What happened to Brian Schaffer? Was it foul play, or is there something darker at play here? Imagine being out with friends, having a good time, and suddenly you realize someone you know has vanished. But there's no sign of struggle, no screams, no broken glass, just an empty, silent mystery that's never been solved. That's exactly what happened to Brian Schaffer. The night of April 1st, 2006, seemed like any other night for Brian Schaffer. A medical student at Ohio State University, Brian had just completed his final exams and was ready to let loose with some friends. He went out to a local bar in downtown Columbus, Ohio, a place he'd frequented before. His friends and girlfriend saw him that night, and everything appeared to be normal. They even talked about their plans for the next day, enjoying the last few hours of their weekend. But something changed that night, something no one could have predicted. As the night wore on, Brian said goodbye to his friends, walked toward the door, and then he was gone. No one noticed anything unusual, but here's the kicker. Security footage from inside the bar shows Brian walking into the establishment, yet mysteriously, there's no footage of him leaving. Brian's friends quickly realized he was missing when he didn't return home. They immediately called the police, who began an intense search of the area. They scoured the streets, checked nearby buildings, and even brought in K9 units to track his scent. But nothing turned up. The strangest part? The surveillance footage from the bar told a different story. Brian was seen on camera entering the bar at around 1:15 a.m. He was wearing a dark shirt, laughing with his friends, and walking calmly through the front door. But after that, the footage is unclear. Despite the bar being under constant surveillance, not a single camera recorded Brian leaving the building. And it gets stranger. The exit doors of the bar were all under constant surveillance as well, yet no one ever saw Brian leave, and there was no sign of him exiting any other door. The bar had multiple cameras in and around it. How could he have simply vanished into thin air? As the days turned into weeks and the investigation went cold, countless theories began to surface. Some suggested that Brian had been the victim of foul play, that someone inside the bar had hurt him, maybe even killed him, and disposed of his body without anyone noticing. Others believed that Brian might have staged his own disappearance, leaving behind a trail of confusion. But why? Some people even speculated about a more bizarre possibility, that Brian had somehow managed to escape through one of the bar's hidden exits, or that someone had assisted him in disappearing. It's an eerie thought. What if Brian was hiding in plain sight the entire time, making his way out of the building, only to vanish into the shadows of Columbus? Then, there's the chilling idea that Brian may have been the victim of a well-orchestrated conspiracy. Was it possible that someone knew Brian's schedule and set him up to disappear that night? Or was it something even darker, an encounter with a dangerous stranger? As months passed without any new leads, the case began to lose momentum. But Brian's family and friends refused to give up hope. The police re-examined the evidence, but every time they thought they were close to finding an answer, New questions arose, leaving them even more confused than before. To this day, no one knows what happened to Brian Schaffer. He hasn't been seen again since that night. The bar where he disappeared remains a constant reminder of a life lost without explanation, and the case remains one of the most haunting mysteries in Ohio's history. Was Brian a victim of a twisted crime, or did he somehow disappear on his own accord? Was someone else involved in his vanishing, or was it all just a bizarre series of events that led to his sudden disappearance? The story of Brian Schaffer is a mystery that's left everyone with more questions than answers. For over a decade, people have been trying to piece together what happened that night in Columbus. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you think Brian's disappearance was the result of something sinister, or was it just an inexplicable set of circumstances? This is one of the most chilling, unsolved murder mysteries in history, a case that still haunts investigators, even almost a century later. In 1922, 6 members of the Gruber family were brutally murdered on their remote farm in Hinterkaifeck, Germany. But the story doesn't end there. Strange occurrences continued to plague the farm long after the murders. Footprints in the snow led to the house, but none led away. The mystery deepens with each eerie detail, and despite years of investigation, the case remains unsolved. What really happened on that lonely farm in the middle of nowhere? Imagine this. You're alone on a farm in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest neighbor. Everything seems peaceful until one day, the silence is broken by something horrific. 6 people, including an elderly couple and their grandchildren, brutally murdered in cold blood. But that's just the beginning. Because after the murders, something even more disturbing starts happening. The question remains, who did it? And why do the strange happenings on the farm continue even after death? The Gruber family lived on a small, isolated farm in Hinterkaifeck, located deep in the Bavarian countryside of Germany. The family, consisting of Andreas Gruber, his wife, their daughter, her 2 children, and a maid, lived a quiet life. The farm was far from the nearest village, with little contact with the outside world. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, and no one could hear you scream if something went wrong. In the weeks leading up to the murders, strange things had started happening. Andreas Gruber, the father, had reported hearing strange noises in the attic, footsteps, movements. He even found strange footprints in the snow that led to the house, but there were none leading away. He told his neighbors about it, but no one could figure out where these mysterious sounds and tracks were coming from. Then, on March 31st, 1922, a day that should have been just like any other, the unimaginable happened. The entire family was slaughtered in cold blood. Andreas, his wife, his daughter, and the 2 grandchildren were all brutally murdered. But what was even more eerie was the fate of the maid, who had been killed the same night. However, the gruesome details of their deaths weren't the only things that sent chills down the spines of the investigators. When authorities arrived at the scene, the house was locked from the inside. There was no sign of forced entry, and nothing appeared to be stolen. It was as if someone had been inside the house for hours, taking their time to commit the murders. The bodies of the victims were discovered in different parts of the house, each one showing signs of brutal violence. But the most chilling part of the investigation came when the police started piecing together the timeline. A neighbor had visited the farm just a day before the murders and found nothing suspicious. In fact, everyone in the village seemed to think that the Grubers were living an ordinary, quiet life. No one could have predicted that something so horrific was about to happen. However, the real mystery began after the murders. Despite the gruesome killings, the farm wasn't abandoned immediately. The police learned that someone, or something, had continued to visit the farm in the days after the murders. The animals in the barn were still being fed, and the farmhouse was still warm. Neighbors reported seeing strange lights flickering at the farm, but when they tried to approach, no one was there. There were no signs of life, but the house wasn't exactly empty. The strangest part? The tracks in the snow. The snow had covered the area leading up to the farm, and the strange footprints that were found earlier by Andreas Gruber suddenly took on an even more terrifying significance. After the murders, investigators found more footprints leading to the house, but this time, none led away. It was as if the murderer, or someone else, had entered the house, but left without a trace. How could this be? Rumors began to swirl around the town, and the fear that gripped the community was palpable. Was the farm haunted? Was it the work of some deranged, unseen figure that had been living in the attic all along? Or was there something more sinister at play here? An inside job, perhaps? Despite extensive investigations, the police were unable to find any solid evidence or identify a suspect. Theories ran wild, ranging from the idea of a vengeful family member to the suggestion that a local worker had been involved. No one could figure out who would want to kill the family in such a brutal manner, or why. As the investigation continued, the strange events at the farm only seemed to increase. Over time, the case went cold. No one was ever arrested, and the mystery of who murdered the Gruber family and why remains unsolved to this day. The Hinterkaifeck murders became one of the most eerie and perplexing unsolved cases in history, and the bizarre paranormal occurrences surrounding the farm only added to the legend. What do you think happened at Hinterkaifeck? Could the murders have been the work of an unknown killer who knew the family's routine? Or was it something darker, something that still lingers on the farm today? Was it a family member's twisted act of vengeance? Or is there a supernatural explanation to these chilling events? The mystery of the Hinterkaifeck murders is one that continues to captivate people to this day. With strange occurrences still reported near the farm and no real answers, it remains a chilling reminder of how sometimes the most terrifying mysteries are the ones that never get solved. If you want to explore more eerie and unsolved mysteries like this one, make sure you subscribe and check out our next video about another chilling case that still keeps people up at night.